All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today we have River Kenna with us, who's a somatic-imaginal guide. And his work is in mythopoetic resonance, soulful embodiment, and somatic meditation. And the title of today's session probably wins the award for most Stoa title, most embodied Stoa title. Mythopoetic Cognition is the engine of mind, somatic meditation and the imaginal. We know us at the Stoa likes jazzy titles, and this one really gets at it. So how today's going to work, I'm going to tag in River in a moment, and he's going to share his thoughts, and we're going to have some practices and then embedded in Q&A for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a formal Q&A afterward. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that, and I'll read your question in the from the chat, and you just put your questions in the chat when you have them. So that being said, River, welcome to the Stoa, and Tag, you are it. Oh, you're on mute.
There we go. All right, I see a few familiar faces. Hello if I've met you before. If not, hi, I'm River Kenna, and yeah, I'm just gonna kick right off with the screen sharing, I do suppose. Do I have permissions for this thing? I do not.
You do
work that out in a moment. All right, so admit. Yeah, so this title, full disclosure, I stole it entirely from Stephen T. Ozma. We'll get to his paper a little later on. Although I did edit his sentence down. He had a lot of clauses in his sentence separating the words. So I'll take editor credit on Mythopoetic Cognition as the engine of mind. Yeah, I'll start by running through my process on some of this. So as you can see, I changed my own subtitle on this from what was the original somatic meditation and imaginal something something. I just went with riff myth because basically I tried making several different versions of a presentation for this, and they went all over the place. I really pulled together like a full framework that I thought everything fit into really nicely. It created a nice, smooth, at least a smooth intellectual experience of how all this fits together. But it was pretty cold when I tried to practice back through it. So instead, I decided to take a more evoking riff-based approach on what I'm doing. And yeah, with a nice little art style for this one. So beginning idea of what's going to cover everything that I talk about here, and is just kind of infused through it, is this quote from James Hillman. Our ideas about the psyche affect the psyche. That's pretty core to everything else I'm going to talk about. And yeah, basically what I'm going through is a few ideas about the psyche that have been enormously helpful and transformative for me and for the people that I've shared them with, and that I'd like to share a little more widely and get some feedback on and just see how they sit with you guys. Starting out here. Yeah, so 4 basic areas I'm going to riff through today. I should get a timer. I'm going to try to limit myself to only 10 minutes per topic here, because I am a long-winded fellow and can go for entirely too long if I'm allowed. The first one being the soma, the body, somatic meditation, how that worked for me, why I got into it, all that stuff. Then over towards inner images. Then we're getting into the imaginal quite a bit. Then we're going to talk about what I call the modes, what a few other thinkers have called other things. We'll look at that. And finally, mythopoetic cognition. Yeah, let's start with the soma. Oh yeah, and I put together like one keyword for each of these. The soma is really about grounding into experience. Inner images, the imaginal, there's a huge element of coherence in those. It just really helps to cohere, for lack of a better term, cohere your life force or life energy, or just your you, whatever we want to call it. The modes offer a way of orienting towards that. Mythopoetic cognition is, yeah, basically about discernment in the way that we live and the stories we tell ourselves about who and what we are. Yeah, before we kick off here, any comments, questions, concerns, anything we want to start off with? Perfect. I'll begin. The soma. So, yeah, this was my basic experience starting out with meditation. I'm sure a lot of people can relate. I lived my entire life up in my head, just a lot of twisting, turning, chewing, everything going, head, for pretty much my entire life. And around my early 20s, this became completely untenable. There was just no way to keep going on like that. So I decided to turn towards meditation because that's the thing that you do, is the impression I got. If your head is messed up, try meditating. It will fix all of your problems. The problem for me was in the type of meditation instruction that I got. And we'll see if you can notice a theme moving through the meditation prompts that were most common and that seem most common still, as far as I can tell. Things like witness your thoughts, find the gap between your thoughts, focus your mind, feel your breath at the nose, still your mind. Your mind is an open sky, just let thoughts drift through it. All of this kept a lot of energy in the head. It kept a lot of focus and awareness straight up here. And it did help to sort out some stuff in my head, so it was less buzzy, a little smoother. But I was still totally out of control inner monologue, still completely stuck in my head. If I didn't have something to feed my head at all times, basically, it would start chewing on me. And that was not helped by the meditation. It kind of just, yeah, my usual comparison for this is it was like I spent my life trapped in a bear trap and meditation gave me some ibuprofen for it, which is lovely. Not going to say no to the ibuprofen, but it wasn't actually addressing any of the root cause for me. So I was about ready to give up and just chalk meditation up to one more thing that didn't work for me in the long list of things that had not worked for me. Then I happened to come across this program, Somatic Descent by Reggie Ray, Experiencing the Ultimate Intelligence of the Body. It's basically a Vajrayana Buddhism redux inflected thing with the keyword somatic, and everything about it was somatic. This is more what meditation instruction felt like while I was going through Reggie Ray's programs. He didn't bother talking about the head or the thoughts, which didn't really strike me at the time. I didn't notice till months later that that's what he was doing. But so much of the instruction literally just started with, can you feel your feet? Can you feel your big toe? What about the joint connecting your big toe to the foot? What can you sense there? Can you feel there? Is there anything that is saying to you? Anything, any qualities of that experience? And before you know it, you've spent 20 minutes hanging out in your big toe before moving up to the ankle. And you haven't had a thought the whole time. You've just been hanging out in the foot. And that was just intoxicating for me. This was the first meditation program I found that I just did for the sake of it. I wasn't forcing myself to sit and do it every day. I just wanted to do it. And after a few months, I noticed, watching a TV show, actually, but I noticed that my inner monologue had just kind of stopped bugging me at some point. And I couldn't trace it back to exactly when it had happened, but it was within a couple months of starting the somatic resonance programs. My thoughts just weren't a problem. I could stare out a window, look at the sky, and there were no thoughts. And it wasn't like a thing I was trying to do, to have no thoughts. It was just what was going on without me noticing for quite a while. It was really a big click moment when I noticed, oh, my head hasn't been torturing me for weeks now. And yeah, it was all thanks to somatic meditation, which was a little odd. I do want to, very brief practice here. So show of, I can't see everyone's faces, but from the people I can see, have we tried somatic meditation before? Do we have some familiarity with just the basics of meditating the body rather than more thought-based meditation? Medium, thumbs up, yeah, medium, okay. So I want to do kind of a quick little 3-4 minute, I wish I could see more faces. Oh, well. Yeah, just a 3 or 4 minute version of, Danny, I see a raised hand. Is that a question or a yes? I'm not sure if you can actually speak.
I can actually speak, and
there we go.
It's meant to be a thumbs up. Yes, go for it.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we'll get to the prompt a little after. But yeah, 3 or 4 quick minute body scan, and I'll guide you through it. And then we'll come back and point at a particular experience going on in the body scan. So first, just find a comfortable way to sit, comfortable posture, whatever you're doing. Now let's just take 3 deep breaths together. Breathing in, notice any tension that you're holding. Breathing out, let it melt away. Breathe in, notice. Breathe out, let go. In, out. And just starting to gently move your attention towards the feet. The toes, the bottom of the foot. Just noticing what it feels like down there. What are the toes like? What is the top of the foot like? Can you feel your ankles? What does it feel like there? Continuing to sync with the breath. Breathe in, notice the foot. Breathe out. Let it release any tension. When the foot has felt about what it needs to, move up to the ankle. What does the ankle feel like? If you have good access to the ankle, move up further, into the calf, into the shin. Giving about 1 more minute. Just continue slowly moving upward. Each time you can feel an area pretty well, move up a little further. And slowly finding your way back towards the room, towards your seat, towards my voice. Another deep breath, and just letting yourself open your eyes back up. Coming back here in your own time. I want to, point towards 2 basic ways that a body scan feels, and just kind of register for yourself which thing I'm describing feels more like what you just experienced. So the first one, by far the most common, is something like there's a me up in my head, And when I bring attention to my feet, this head me is the one experiencing it. It is kind of reaching out, feeling the feet, noticing how they feel, and then moving upwards. The head me notices the ankles, reaches out to check in on those, shines a little spotlight down through the body onto the ankles. Are they fine? Good. Moving on. That's kind of the first way that body scans tend to go. The other one is a little closer to this prompt, the body being aware of itself. So something more like the foot has its own awareness of being a foot before you ever try to pay attention to it, before you ever attempt to move down and scan it, there's already awareness in your foot. So what it feels like is less me checking out the foot and more the awareness that's already in the foot, just taking up a little more space, bringing itself to your attention a little more vividly, shining a little bit brighter in your experience. The ankle, taking up a little more experiential space, the calf, the knees, the thighs, all of this up through the whole body, becoming aware of itself rather than a me becoming aware of it. Yeah. This is kind of the key change for me. This is the core, at least a core move of somatic meditation, is that when we are able to find this experience of the body being aware of itself, of the foot just being aware of being a foot, of the head me stepping back and not so much being a part of what's going on, not needing to be a part of what's going on. That is a hugely transformative move. And when we're able to find that, a lot of stuff just starts falling into place. Things that we've pushed into the body and kind of leave there and ignore start coming up on their own, start bringing themselves to our attention, and start just relaxing and unknotting themselves quite a bit. But yeah, this is really the key move that everything else seems to unfold from in somatic meditation. And you can kind of see the main effect for me and for a lot of people just in the illustrations. It's almost a gravitational draining. Wherever your focus of your mind goes, wherever your awareness puts itself, that's where a lot of your experience day to day tends to be. So for me, all of it was in my head all the time. And this literally just drained it and distributed it back to where it needed to be, putting my experience back in the body. It was lovely. Can't recommend it enough. But yeah, so if somatic meditation had done nothing else, if that had been the only thing it did was soften my inner monologue, gave me a more embodied sense walking around, made meditation more pleasant, more lovely to come back to, that would have been enough for me to chill it until the end of time. But that was pretty much just getting started. And again, yeah, keyword grounding, moving from the head, grounding into the body, grounding into experience. And after a while, this pretty naturally turned into inner images. So this one, yeah, now we're getting a little further out of normal meditation type stuff. But yeah, basically, when I spent enough time in the body, just being open to whatever experience was there, a lot of what was there turned out to be inner images, which is a term I'm lifting from Carl Jung. He said, the years when I pursued the inner images were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. I'll assume most people know generally about what the Red Book from Carl Jung is. I have probably read some of it in some cases, but short version is, yeah, he had a period in his life where he was kind of overcome with a lot of narrative content, imagistic content, a lot of, yeah, imaginal and inner image stuff. And everything in his career after that pretty much unfolded from that. We know who Carl Jung is and think of him as, yeah, father of depth psychology, dude who brought archetypes and shadow and whatnot to our attention, largely because he decided to dive into these inner images when they started bringing themselves up to him. And one of his students, back to James Hillman again, gave this brief description of what we're talking about. He said, "The gift of an image is that it provides a place to watch your soul." There's another phrasing of this I like, that if we cannot see the wind, we can at least see the wind's will. Similar idea here. When we have these internal, we'll get to the word image and how it's not precisely a visual image. But whatever these things are, the sense of narrative, of setting, of an image coming to us, and we watch how they unfold, how they move, how they show up in meditation. That gives us a lot of information and a lot of direct experience of just how the psyche is moving, how it is patterning our experience, how it tends towards everything. Yeah, image is not my favorite word for this, but other people seem to have decided on it long before I was born, so we just get to keep it. But some other things that point at the same area are things like impression, dream, myth, lore, felt narrative, vision, fantasy. It's very much just this sense of, this inner set of experiences that allow us to directly experience how we are organizing what we see, what we feel, our inner lives, our relationships. And a lot of it does come up visually flavored, we'll say. So sometimes visual directly, often visually flavored, but not usually the most important part being visual. The most important part is the impression, the sense of narrative and significance that comes with it. Yeah, just to draw back get to the core of it and draw back the somatic element of this. This is from The Body Keeps the Score. He said, "As long as you keep secrets and suppress information, you are fundamentally at war with yourself. The critical issue is allowing yourself to know what you know." That is the key line for inner imagery, and especially somatic imagery for me. The critical issue is allowing yourself to know what you know. So much of what we know about ourselves and our lives, we just kind of keep unconscious. We just keep pushing down, don't really look at it, put a lot of effort into not being aware of it. In images, it becomes much, much harder to avoid, much, much harder to not see. And that's a large part of the value here. We can just watch how our psyche is moving, how our experience is directly patterned. And it becomes really difficult to avoid and almost impossible to not work with. And so paraphrasing James Hillman, he's kind of the guy on this. The task of the imaginal is to let the image be the image rather than turning it into concepts and phonemes. Let the image be the image. So don't intellectualize it, don't conceptualize it. When something comes up in meditation, in dream, in the imaginal, let it be what it is. Because the way that it presents itself has its own message, right? And furthermore, playing out the image allows the inner ecology of the psyche to play itself out, balance itself, and to unfold. Ecology seems like a really important and appropriate metaphor here. There's just a lot of stuff going on in the psyche that's always trying to, dynamically balance itself out, move through itself, playing out the images, allowing them to be what they are, bringing them into meditation, bringing them into the soma, into somatic meditation, noticing how they play through the body. All of this has a really strong texture of letting things unfold, of leaning into a process is maybe the best way to describe it. The process is already happening. You can lean into it and help it to happen. Yeah, so I want to give one or two examples to kind of bring this out of abstraction let's pick the two simplest ones. So the police officer. This is an example from Blue Fire by James Hillman. He talks about specifically a dream image that a patient came to him with, where yeah, there's a police officer chasing you down the street, and then you wake up terrified, your heart beating, think you're going to get thrown into prison, and you take a minute to try to calm yourself down, talk yourself down. And what you do is start turning the police officer into a set of concepts that, oh, I have a guilt complex. Oh, I run away from my problems. That's what this is about. And what you've done there is you've taken this really strong and emotionally loaded image of the police officer chasing you, this beating heart, this strong feeling that, oh my God, something is here. And you've turned it into some syllables, right? It's guilt complex. It's just, oh yeah, it's a thing I do. I run from problems. And it's a way of depotentiating the threat, of just kind of draining the power away from this thing that was scary to you, right? And this is really powerful in dream work, to, in dreams, come out of the dream, journal it, write it down, and return to it later, seeing if the image wants to continue unfolding further. But I've been doing a dream work practice like that for years. And even I sometimes will wake up and notice myself terrified from whatever's going on in the dream. And the immediate impulse is trying to intellectualize it. I'm barely awake, and already I'm going like, okay, it was an owl. Owls are scary, but owls are just symbols of this, this, and this, so it's probably fine. And then I'll catch myself. I'm trying to intellectualize it, to just drain it of the power, to drain it of the potential that it has if I let the owl be the owl, if I let the police officer be the police officer. Yeah. And then I'll give the very quick version of the bison one. This one has been probably the clearest example in my own life. And the short version is that pretty much my entire life, I was very, I don't know, authority-centric, I guess. I wanted someone to tell me the right answer for what path I should be on. And there was a particular dream I was working on that involved a bison. And while I was working with the dream, it came up that I should ask the bison this question of like, what should I do with my life? What is my path? What do I do? And I was hoping for something like, move to Japan and join a Zen monastery. They'll put yourself on that conveyor belt and you'll know what to do. Or go join the Sufis, go somewhere for that. The bison just kind of looked at me and looked like straight through me, basically, to the me that was lying on the floor meditating and doing this. He said, okay, so you're lying on the floor, you're doing breath work, you're doing dream work that you've like learned about from a ton of sources, ranging from, you know, ancient dream work to modern psychologists. How does this not seem like a path to you? The path is already under your feet. You just got to keep walking it. And that seems like it was a very simple and direct thing. But in about the week or so after that bit of dream work, this pattern I'd had my entire life of like really strongly gravitating towards, what do I do? What is my path? What should I put myself towards? That completely dissolved. That psychic knot that had just been pulling at me for 10, 20 years was kind of just gone. And I was pretty immediately like, okay, I'm doing what I'm doing. And yeah, there's a definite sense of unfolding here. So let's follow that. So I just offer that as like an example of the type of thing I'm talking about in a grounded way of how does this actually do anything, help anything? In my case, you just kind of work with images for a long time, and at some point, a lifelong knot undoes itself apropos of nothing. And then you just don't have that problem anymore. That doesn't happen every time, but it's happened often enough where I just trust the process at this point. And yeah, I'm leaving out a lot of the somatically inflected elements of this because of time concerns. Yeah, keyword here is coherence. There's just a lot going on inside of us. And by leaning into the images that present themselves to us, by leaning into the somatically inflected narrative and imagistic content, it helps to bring about a huge amount of coherence and just untangle knots that are sitting there. All right, so that's midpoint, and I'm going to open up to just any questions or comments here. But just summing up where we're at so far. Mind-based meditation didn't do a lot for me, so I deepened into the body. That brought a lot of grounded openness for me. From that openness, I got impressions and narrative content coming up through the body into the mind, through the soul. Working with those restored more coherence and flow into my life. That's kind of our trajectory so far. Yeah, opening up to, I'll leave that. So thoughts, comments, questions, concerns. Just gonna take 5-7 minutes in the middle here. Peter Limburg raised his hand. Yes, Peter.
Yeah, I have this is really good stuff, by the way. Really enjoying this presentation. And one thing that came up is intrusive thoughts, this concept of intrusive thoughts. And I guess you could say intrusive images as well. So like disturbing thoughts or images that just like pop in your mind that are often like socially taboo, whether it's like murderous or perverse thoughts that just feel really disturbing to have. And there's this book called Imp of the Mind, exploring the silent epidemic of obsessive bad thoughts, and they have like strategies to deal with it. But I'm curious how you hold like what those are, the intrusive thoughts and intrusive images, and how this somatic approach that you're presenting could deal with it or address it.
Yeah, so a few separate things there. One, at least for me, a lot of the like really negative, violent, self-hating, other-hating, just the bad intrusive thoughts that are like the really taboo things just jumping into mind. For me, those were all connected to this inner monologue of just my mind spinning, going. And they all had that same texture. When things would come up, it was because the mind needed something to spin on and it just went. I don't really get those anymore ever since 6 or 7 years ago when that died down and dropped into the body. So that, for me at least, solved that particular problem. And what I tend to, so I actually have a reframe of intrusive thoughts, because it seems like there's a, intrusive thoughts, what people call them, seem to describe two different things. One is that where the brain just spins up something because it needs to spin up something. The darker and more attention grabbing, the better. The second one is a little harder to describe, but I've called it before like perceived thoughts. And it's where you, sometimes I'll just walk into a room and it's like there's a thought waiting there for me or an image waiting there for me. And it's not like I'm spinning it out. It's not like I'm pulling it together. It's just like turning a corner somewhere and you see a new building. Same here. You'll just walk in and sometimes, oh, there's just a thought in this space. And that's what it is. And this happens much more often in social situations when there's several people pulled together. And I'll walk into a space, something will come up. And when I bring it up to the people, it usually seems to be pretty relevant to whatever they're thinking about, whatever they're going on about. So yeah, there do seem to be just thoughts and images in the air sometimes, just waiting for us to notice and grab them. Yeah. Anything else? Other thoughts or comments?
David has a question in the chat. David, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting, River. I'm thinking, since I really like fiction writing, I'm curious about the idea of, allowing these inner images to come up and then forming larger coherent stories out of them, but without necessarily the intellectual explanation about what's going on psychologically. So I'm curious how that form of bringing the mental into it, how you think that might play out.
Yeah, how much time do we got? Yeah, so a couple things here. One, I write that way fairly often. There's something that I was just finishing up a couple weeks ago where I basically had a single sentence prompt that had like come to me that was really evocative based off of an image that I saw. I laid down, dropped into meditation, just literally dropped the phrase in to see what happened. And over the course of 20 or 30 minutes, it just unfolded into a very clear narrative and clear set of like, hard to describe. There was a flow. There was one cloth that just unfolded from all of that. And the overwhelming impression was like, write that down and then you can come back for more. Because there were several things throughout it that were clearly pointing to like later developments. And I was like, what happened there? Why did the seal go off that way? You're just like, come back for more when you've written that down. Get it there first. So that's part one. Very useful for this. Part two is that this actually brings up an element of experience in the imaginal that should probably be divided a bit. Yeah, so when we bring in terms like imaginal and imagination, a lot of people think of daydreaming. That's extremely differently textured to imaginal work. Like daydreaming, you can kind of watch things pull together. You can see yourself maybe off this way, no, maybe this way, no, pulling together. Fiction ideation has a similar thing where you can watch yourself passing through different ideas. And there's really cool moments making narrative art of any sort where a bunch of those come together and like click. And that for me is like writing genre or something, when the 5 different threads all pull together, like, oh my God, that's what those were all going towards. That is also slightly different. In a lot of imaginal work, and especially the deeper you get into it, it's more kind of like what I described with the perceived thoughts thing, where it's almost like you're rounding a corner, and once you turn somewhere, the image, the narrative, the thing is just there. There's no sense of it pulling together, of it kind of moving around. It's just an object, and it's there, and it's obvious. And yeah, that's a thing that I don't describe a lot and have been feeling like I should describe more. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. I'm seeing hands from Alice.
Hi, thanks. This is super interesting. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how emotions fit into all of this. Yeah, is that, maybe that's too much of a big one, but
Keep going.
like is that part of the kind of somatic stage of the focus of this meditation before you kind of dive into or kind of receive the images that come up? So I guess with somatic meditation, I'm often quite tempted to focus on just the center line where a lot of the emotions are, because that feels fruitful. But I'm wondering if that's a bit limited, and are you letting your foot be aware of itself, and then a lion image comes up or something like that, and then it has some really deep resonance, is what I'm getting at.
All right, so incredibly complex question, A. Oh, I lost your thing. Oh, there you are. B, so there's just 2 things I'm going to say. One, as far as somatic imaginal moving towards emotional work goes, do you happen to know Relic Radiation on Twitter? Elena? Okay.
No.
Go to Twitter, follow Relic Radiation and the guy she works with named James Mayfield. Excellent for somatic emotional work. Yeah. They'll get you sorted and set on everything about that. B, an important thing I want to note here is that in basically all of this somatic, imaginal, mythosomatic, whatever work we want to call it, the goal is to get a few building blocks in place, a few core competencies in place, and then be able to freestyle with them as you move through the practice. That's kind of the end goal, is to be able to move and sense what wants to happen next, what wants to unfold next, where things are going. And so in a given situation, yeah, the thing that is most central might be an emotional knot that needs to be brought into focus. In other situations, the emotion might be you avoiding some other deeper emotion or some bit of really bad pain in your hip that you don't want to feel. So you're just going to focus on how sad you are instead. And that's a type of running away. So yeah, freestyling is the main thing. everything else is crazy, crazy complicated and getting up to that point of freestyling. I've got time for one more, Linnea.
Wonderful. I'm so sorry my video is not working right. I'm so grateful for this. I am at a point where I have this crazy, intense imagination space, and it's often very visual. And so I have used for many years now yoga and intentional movement to bring a sort of calm to that. And so I think part of my question is sort of coming at this from the opposite end and piggybacking off the last question too, because there seems to be like this presentation of an image often, and this is why I struggled with seated meditation for a long time, because I would just get flooded with images, and I would receive it, and if I tried to touch it, often it would become like all of a sudden I could bring it into a sort of daydream that may be adaptive or maladaptive, or it may thread itself into some sort of fiction narrative that I knew that I was mostly controlling, but I didn't really want to control because I wanted to receive it as kind of a message. And so at this point, yeah, I was just wondering what kind of steps forward you would recommend, or resources to sort of navigate that kind of experience where you are very much like receiving all of this information and wanting to like filter it, but maybe sometimes like just getting this sense of overwhelm. And part of that is, I think, because I have chronic pain, and I will get these like intense images associated with like my own self trying to narrate the pain into meaning. But so I shut it off, I dissociate. It's a very helpful coping mechanism, but overly used in my opinion, and I'd like to use it less. And like increase these tools so that I can relate with a lot more confidence and ease of access to receive the like genius and gorgeousness of my being and how it interprets like sensorially my reality, right?
Yeah. So narrowing down onto like, so there's a lot to say there, and I'd need to like ask you some more questions to really pinpoint a thing. Feel free to get at me. Like there's a contact form on my website or just on Twitter. B, what it is sounding like from right now is something like concentration meditation would be helpful to be able to like zero in on a thing and stay with it. With the caveat that like breath is not the only object to concentrate on. You can practice concentration meditation with images that come up. So if an image comes up, try to stay with one of them. And when others intrude, just set them aside. No, not now, not now, not now. Staying with the one and continuing on with that. That tends to build a capacity to kind of handle and stay with one thing. And B, it does, in my experience at least, tend to build some kind of trust with the other ones of like, there will be time for us. You're paying attention now, so it's fine. We don't have to flood you as much. So that would be like my narrowed down to one recommendation is concentration meditation on the object of whatever particular image comes up. All right, so I talked too long and we went over on midway break, but it's perfectly fine. I'll just see what I can get done in the latter half. We all good to move along? Any objections or questions or pressing concerns? Cool. All right, moving from experience into explanation. Oh, right, I'm really gonna need to, it's fine. So side note, meta note, a lot of this stuff I am going to be articulating more moving forward. So I'm going to give very shoddy, quick versions of these at the moment that just get across the vibe. Come check in later for more stuff. I'll have other videos and writings about these. But for now, the modes. What can I say about the modes? So out of these, we've got a few pairings around stuff. Technic and Magic is a book by Federico Campagna about worldviews or reality settings, as he calls them, types of reality that we live in. Keats had a thing called negative capability as opposed to positive capability. This one's probably the most famous. I'd assume at least half the people or more in this room are familiar with McGilchrist's right and left hemisphere work. Is that a fair assumption to make? Show of nods or yeses or nos? A lot of nods, a few mediums, yeah. And then Proust also pointed at this in Habit and Art. Basically, the thing across all of these is that there are two main modes that human minds work in. One of them is very workaday, very habitual, very focused. It's how we spend most of our time. And the other one is much more open and receptive and making itself available to things that are not so much the workaday, moment-to-moment stuff. So I tend to call these, for my purposes, systematic mode and spontaneous mode. Really spontaneous style, but that is a thing I can get into another time. I'm not going to bother with that bit. Yeah, let's take a look here. So, where did I put the other? Here we go. So here, systematic mode is a lot of the stuff we might expect. It is very focused and it is very, very concerned with control. Control is the key word. When we are in systematic mode, we want to know things, we want to control things, we want to know how things work so that we can more properly manipulate them and move our world around us. And it is extremely experientially claustrophilic. It loves that tight feeling of working through like a tunnel, working through a problem, being really focused and narrowed down on what is right in front of it and pushing everything else out of the way. And that is where the problem begins. When we're in this all the time, we're very focused on what is important and completely leaving out everything that doesn't matter. But the only thing deciding what does and doesn't matter is the part of us obsessed with control. That creates problems. Just to give the most salient example, the way that we treat like a physics problem is not the way that we treat a relationship problem, right? People do not like to be treated like problems to solve, like objects to be worked with and manipulated properly. It doesn't work as well. Same with just the general sense of meaning and purpose and aliveness in our lives. You can't tinker and manipulate yourself into feeling alive in the moment and having a sense of purpose and meaning to what you're doing, right? Yeah, this is very relevant to the somatic-imaginal stuff because, here we go. McGilchrist is the one who pointed this out that made it really, really clear to me when he said the left hemisphere sees the body as an object that is beneath it. So both literally and metaphorically for the systematic mode, the body is beneath me. My me is up here. Everything else is underneath me. It's just an object to be moved. There is no fundamental difference between my hand and the cup my hand is holding. They are both objects that are sometimes useful to me, right? McGilchrist also pointed out that the spontaneous mode, which we'll look at over here, the left or the right side of the brain is the only part of the brain with a whole body image, the one that experiences the body as a whole being, right? This is where somatic meditation comes in. This sense of letting the body feel itself, letting the body be aware of itself, of stepping into that whole awareness of yourself as a body, that gives entry to the spontaneous mode, to the left hemisphere, to magic, to negative capability, whatever system we kind of put this into, moving with the whole body image, becoming the whole body image, developing this sense of awareness. That's what allows us to get into that. And I use the term agoraphilic for it because, yeah, this one loves open spaces and receptivity. And this is part of why, at least as far as I can tell, somatic meditation leads fairly reliably into the imaginal and into imagery. Because once you are no longer focused on your body as an object, as a thing, as a body map that you can pretty precisely pin down, once you just open up to whatever is there to be experienced, noticing whatever is coming up in the body's field of experience and allowing it to present itself, a lot of what starts to present itself is stuff that does not make sense rationally. Yeah, there's a lot of examples from people I've worked with. I'll just use one from my own early on that struck me pretty strongly. I was meditating, and it was fairly normal somatic meditation I was doing, nothing unusual that day. And then I suddenly noticed that there were 2 warring kingdoms of dragons in my left thigh. And then I stopped meditating because that struck me, because that makes no sense. That's not a thing. That's not in the realm of what are the possible things to be in your thigh, right? I could have maybe put up with like aggression is in my thigh, like emotions get stored in the muscle and the tissue. Fine, cool, good, workable. When we get to weird imagery, that you have to be completely spontaneously open to. And that is really what the spontaneous mode is about, is receiving whatever is actually there without filtering it through even unconscious filters of what you think is possible to be there. And yeah, I've got a few other qualities around here. When we move into spontaneous mode, there's a sense of open curiosity, exploratory humility. It's unfixated. It doesn't get obsessed with things in the same way. Inner silence. There's much less of this looping thought pattern stuff going on. And yeah, direct experience of the body. You are the body. You're not thinking about the body, not shining a spotlight on particular areas of the body. You're just the body. It's what you are, right? Yeah, so the main thing I want to call out shortly about systematic and spontaneous mode is something captured in this image, which is from my capacities graph. Don't try to read it, it's just different qualities. But yeah, there's systematic mode and spontaneous mode, and these are not like hard objects, like, especially from like left hemisphere, right hemisphere language, it can be easy to think of them as things, right? Much more helpful experientially when trying to actually work with them, to think of them as clusters of habits. And importantly, clusters of habits that you can move between. So the most important thing thinking about these 2 modes of being is that if we're frustrated with the systematic mode, with the left hemisphere, with our habitual self, whatever we want to call it, the solution does not tend to be in working directly on that, trying to fix up what's going on over here and untangle all those knots. What is much more helpful is moving from this cluster of behaviors, being very focused, narrowed down, usually a bit arrogant, usually blocking out anything you don't think is important, from that over to this spontaneous cluster of behaviors and attitudes and habits of openness, curiosity, literal open awareness of the space around you, allowing the body to be aware of itself rather than being ahead of me with a body beneath it. Yeah, so I'll often see people frustrated with their inner monologue, with their very narrowed, focused thing, and wanting to stop doing that. But they do it in a very systematic way where they're trying to make lists of habits that they can change and intellectually tinker with their inner monologue and inner critic to make it go away. That doesn't tend to work. It just adds more energy to this system, right? Instead, every time we notice that we're stuck in thought loops, we're stuck in a bit of arrogance and a bit of preconceived notions about how things are and what they work, use that as a cue to jump over towards something a little more spontaneous, towards just noticing the body, noticing the space around you, developing a sense of curiosity, exploration, humility. And over time, these clusters start to separate out a bit, and you start to be able to actually spend more time in the one that does meaning and purpose and aliveness, basically. Those all come from the spontaneous mode. They don't come from systematic narrowing down and blocking things out. Yeah. So that's the really short version. In the longer version, I am much kinder to the systematic mode because it's incredibly useful when it has its proper relationship to things, but we'll leave that aside for now. So yeah, that's why the key word here is orientation. Trying to orient ourselves towards spontaneity, towards openness, rather than being frustrated with collapsed awareness when we find it. Which, yes, you'll notice is kind of an echo of the earlier bit from somatic meditation, where mind meditation didn't work for me because it was all focused on the mind. It stayed in the mind. The thing that managed to fix my mind was moving towards the body and ignoring the mind entirely, just letting it worry about itself for a while the body opened up to itself. Same basic move here. All right, and finally, and this one's going to be, how's my time? This one will be short, which is probably merciful because this is the one that, yeah. Let's take a moment to notice that the phrase feels like a bridge. Yeah, so just this phrase is incredibly evocative. Mythopoetic cognition. I tried just saying this to several people to see how they would react to the phrase itself. Most often the reaction was something like just, in one case, literally stopping in their tracks while on a walk. Like, oh my God, like mythopoetic cognition, that connects things. Oh my God. And then had to stand in place and process for a good 30 seconds before we could continue the walk. This feels like a bridging, like an opening of possibilities, putting mythopoesis next to something like cognition in cognitive science. I just want to very briefly note that the fact that these two things seem like separate worlds, mythopoesis, narrative, story, animism, basically, and cognitive science, cognition, the brain. These feel very different, mostly just due to a quirk in sociology. There is nothing inherent to this field that makes it more apt to be systematic brained. It's just kind of how things have worked out, largely because you look at the textbooks for cognitive science, gears in the head, maze, cognitive science journal, a maze. I looked, Google image cognitive science sometimes. You're going to find a lot of wires in people's heads, a lot of stuff that looks like fiber optic cables running through people's heads, gears. This idea that the mind is a mechanical thing, that it is a computer chip, that it is gears, that it can be organized into flowcharts and explained this way. It's kind of a feedback mechanism because the people who think like this become attracted to the field, become experts in the field, espouse that worldview further in their own textbooks, in the way that they study the thing, in the way that they approach it, which then attracts more students who have that worldview and want to explore it, and then they become the experts and put it out into the culture even more. It's just kind of a sociological feedback loop where the people who really want to see the brain as a machine and the mind as a machine and the mind as the brain find what they need in that worldview in this field, and thus are attracted to the field and continue to reify the view. And yeah, seriously, I found so much imagery around this. It was everywhere. And yes, another Cambridge Handbook of Cognitive Science, dude's head made out of gears. That's just what the field looks like. So stepping aside from that and just noticing that mythopoetic cognition can be a completely everyday normal way of looking at things, I just want to point us towards the main journal, the main dude pointing at a lot of this, Stephen T. Ozma. There's a whole issue of Evolutionary Studies in Imaginative Culture, Volume 5, Number 2 from fall of 2021. Go download the thing. That whole volume is basically Stephen T. Ozma's articles about mythopoetic cognition and adaptive imagination, or responses to it. And this is just one of the first sentences of his description here. A mythopoetic paradigm or perspective sees the world primarily as a dramatic story of competing interpersonal intentions, rather than a system of objective impersonal laws. So this is basically the switch away from mind as computer, objective impersonal laws, into noticing how we actually experience our mind and how it seems to be organized, which is along much more almost animistic lines, right? Unless, yeah. Who has never yelled at their toaster out of fury? That's not a rational thing. If we were computer brains, we would not be screaming at our toaster for it to work a little better, or petting the hood of our car going, you got it, girl, just heat up. You can go another mile, just one more mile. No, these are mythopoetically inflected things, and they just tend to be how we work in our actual experience. When we move through our day and through our life, the world is mostly made up of, yeah, allies, enemies, settings, and this one, very psychically inflected. We have psychological settings, much more so than physical settings a lot of the time. When you walk around, you notice, oh, this room has a lot of fear in it for me. That's a part of your setting. That's a part of how you move through the world. It's not an objective thing that's in the room. Quests and side quests, narrative and animism, these tend to be what organize our day. And this author pulled a move that I really enjoyed in one of his papers, where in the middle, he dropped this paragraph. You can read it if you'd like. Basically what he's saying through this paragraph is, hey, this is written in an academic journal, and a lot of you are probably very intellectual people reading this. You might be disagreeing pretty strongly with what I say, but even this article, a seemingly neutral bit of cognitive information, is slowly becoming your friend or foe, depending on how much it accords with your already formed sense about the world, your sense of mind, et cetera, et cetera. This one line kind of summed up the whole paper for me. Because yeah, for me, it was very much the experience of, this paper is my friend. I can use this for a lot of things. I can just kind of point at this and it will explain a lot of what I've been thinking about lately. Cool. I can also vividly imagine lots of people who are getting increasingly pissed off reading this paper and then hit this line, and it just makes them even more pissed off. Yeah, this is kind of the vibe that we're looking at here, that the mind is mythopoetic in our experience of the mind. And the key word here becomes discernment, because once we notice that our day-to-day experience is mostly made up of narrative, of character, of friends and foes, where are my allies? What are my enemies? What are the motivation sets that are happening around me? What is moving me through this day? Even the simplest things like going to work when you would rather not go to work, what is happening there? It's not a calculation. It is a larger sense of what you are doing with your life, who you are, the type of identity you have, all of this stuff. And yes, this phrase by Mary Midgley, basically that if we try to ignore the way that myth shapes and inflects our life, we will end up enslaved to incompetent forms of it. So Mary Midgley her actual thing for this was, she has a whole book called Myths We Live By. She means myth in a very specific sense. So this was more philosophical, but equally true in this sense. When we try to ignore that we have quote unquote irrational organizing impulses, and we try to convince ourselves that actually, no, we don't, we end up just falling into worse and worse versions of it because we refuse to look at it, right? And yeah, I think I'll leave it there. There's a few more things I want to say, but I'll have mercy at this point. Yeah, so just summing this up here, the mind runs on mythopoesis. This connects back to our imaginal work, because that is why the mind responds so well to mythopoetic cues, like image, like narrative, like more precisely mythosomatic cues, these cues in the body of how emotion and motivation and imagery all come up and are tied together. We respond to this because it's the basis of our experience, the base of who we are and what we do. And yeah, so I'll wrap this up. This is one possible gesture at the whole fabric nature of all these four things. So like I said, all four of these things are really one cloth as I see them. There's not really a way to separate them. But one way to look at that is, yes, somatic resonance leads us into spontaneous openness. Spontaneous openness lets us receive inner images, day-to-day mythopoesis, all this stuff. And then working specifically in imaginal and mythosomatic practice while in the spontaneous mode, that is very important for reasons we did not get to, lets us interact directly with the root nature of our mind and affect transformation effortlessly from the bottom up. Effortlessly is putting it a little too strong, but it can feel that way sometimes. After a lot of base effort, it seems like things almost happen of themselves when they do happen. Yeah, I'll wrap that up. So, thus riffed me. That's how I did it. We're done now. Here's all the places where you can find me. I'm on Twitter mostly. Just pay attention to the Twitter and that'll be fine. Yeah, so open to any questions. I'll turn it over to Peter to say or do whatever he would like.
All right. I'll leave this screen up for a bit so people can get this info, but let's give River a round of applause. That was an excellent presentation. Well done. And I know how difficult and frustrating it is to hold many different practices and concepts and then not having them speak together to each other, but then having that ability when they weave together in a coherent whole like you did today is quite a feat. So congrats on that. And if you have any questions, pop them in the chat. We'll go for another 20 or so minutes. My first question would be about your practice. The curiosity is like, what does your actual practice look like if someone wants to do some somatic-imaginal work with you?
Oh, so if like someone else is coming in for practice.
Well, someone wants to, like, on your website, you have a coaching practice, somatic-imaginal coaching practice.
Oh yeah, that's learning building blocks. So key point on that I should often make clear, none of that is like somatic therapy or emotional work or anything like that. It is very much training on core building blocks of imaginal practice, because they're often difficult to suss out on your own. I have found that the hardest bit is permission for people. They don't give themselves permission to like trust that they're doing something correctly or that something is valid. So it seems to be really helpful to just have a couple weeks of going through the 7 or 8 just like core key imaginal moves and having someone guiding them through it who will go, yep, you're doing fine. Yep, that was fine too. Yeah. Training, that's it. Because like I said, the goal for everything is to get up to like freestyling with some of these capacities. Anything that helps you move towards that ability to freestyle is the work.
Yeah, that's good. So getting your reps in, because like I imagine there's
Essentially.
Yeah, insecurity if am I doing this right or not, which disrupts the process. Danny, you had your hand up.
Yes. Wonderful. I want to mirror what Peter said. To be able to bring together different modes, that's what I see you doing. You don't have to be in one or the other. You're playing with how do these all go together. I love the word fabric. So what I was not clear listening to you was somatic, senseful, felt sense somatic, and emotion. Okay, both of which can be imaginal. They're part of this. But I heard you going to conceptual. Yes, that's a little clearer. But in the somatic, it's like when we say, well, how is that affecting you? How is that impacting you? Am I going to answer with an emotion? Am I going to answer with a sensation? So I just would like to hear how you're playing with that.
Yeah. The thing that's immediately coming up is I was recently in Berlin for a couple months on a fellowship with a bunch of people. I don't often get a chance to be with a bunch of people who are basically familiar with a lot of the same stuff. Yes, Medley, that's the one. Who are pretty much familiar with the stuff that I've been digging into and who can speak in the same ways about it. And the conversations I think you would have enjoyed immensely, because a lot of them had this fluid nature where, yeah, people would answer with an image or an emotion, or more often, a lot of things would start bleeding into each other. Where, yeah, you might ask someone, I don't know, you're deep in a conversation about a particular meditation that happened, and you ask a pointed question about how it's interacting with their life, and they'll just sit for a moment and go, there's a lot of like tightness in my chest, and it's almost like there's like a saw, like the image of when a saw hits the metal and it starts like really, there's a lot of that tension being cut. And so again, all of this feels like one cloth. It is one fabric. And yeah, I don't tend to talk about the emotional side of things a lot. And that is largely because I can't separate it very well from the somatic. Like I can if I'm in a conversation where I have to place the cut on things, sure, I'll do it. But it does feel somewhat unnatural. So thank you for reflecting that, though, that I don't talk about the emotional side of this very much, because it doesn't seem separate to me.
You gave a beautiful example of exactly that, whether it's a saw versus, I'm feeling terror or whatever. I have one other distinction I would like to hear, that the image, I happen to be an image person, so I'm really hearing all of that. But I also am aware that many people are music and sound and resonance, and as opposed to visual. Visual doesn't, in fact, impact them, doesn't go as deep. So I just want to hear how you're meeting that.
Yeah, so I've actually had a few aphantasic people take my workshops.
What's that word?
Aphantasic, people who literally like do not have the capacity to picture things internally. Okay. And they seem to be fascinated with what I'm doing because it's very weird to them, I guess. But that is when I have more time to be even more long-winded than I was today. This is a struggle that I like to bring up quite a bit, that the language around a lot of this is incredibly visual. Even the ancient term for a lot of this, I had a vision. That doesn't necessarily mean that A, it was visual, or B, that the most important parts of it were visual. And a good way to point to a lot of this is A, through dreams, and B, more familiarly through psychedelics for a lot of people. Like, hey, when you say that like a dragon inhabited you during this acid trip, were you like seeing flames and scales or something? No, it was like a very somatically, it's psychedelics. It's a sense that you have. It's this inner thing of, oh, there's suddenly a strong sense that a cosmic dragon is eating my soul. That's a weird thing to have a sense of, but acid be acid. Similar in the imaginal in a toned down way. We talk in visual terms, isn't necessarily visual, and the most important elements of it are, definitely not visual.
All right, thank you, Danny. David, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. I have this desire to, take all of this somatic experience that I could get more and more of and unify it all into like a fictional world or something like that. I guess I'm wondering if you're familiar with that kind of project, rather than it just being a lot of various things, that it all be one thing, and like, are there potential drawbacks to trying to do that?
So the thing that comes up to me, just as a person who has tried frustrating creative projects before, where I try again and again to get the thing that's in me out of me and expressed, and yet there are large parts of it that don't make the trip, that just don't make the journey and get onto the page or whatever. The main thing that's coming up is that would be an enormously frustrating endeavor in this way, because just pointing back towards the systematic and spontaneous aspect of this, words and verbalization are inherently somewhat systematic. There's a lot that you can do in spontaneous ways with them, particularly like what I call metabolic journaling, of just like really free writing, getting in a flow of write, it doesn't matter what comes out. that can be very spontaneous, but it's also often not very fun to read, right? Have you ever read someone's morning pages? Not ideal. So yeah, I'm not gonna say that something is like impossible. Go do it, go prove me wrong, get at it. B, I would not have the stomach to put up with that. It seems like a process that would be very frustrating, but very rewarding if you can nail it. So good luck and Godspeed.
All right. Ron, you had a question or share?
Yeah, thank you. Hey, River. Yeah, I was just wondering, hopefully this isn't getting too much into the weeds or is a technicality, but I'm wondering if you distinguish between image and symbol. And one reason I'm asking that, or was prompted by Zach Stein speaking on the Stoa once about distinguishing that, and he was influenced by Hillman as well on the imagery, but in his kind of metapsychology, it's very key to distinguish between image and symbol. And I know as someone who has some image issues, like we were just talking about, symbol has more potency. So I'm just wondering if you make that distinction, or if you're just kind of, they both fall under imagery for you.
Yeah, so I have an enormous privilege in that I don't have to be putting out like consistent frameworks, and people don't like listen to me a bunch. So it's fine. So I have a feeling if I was trying to be more coherent, I would draw that distinction. The main distinction, most of my work is experiential. I work with people, guiding them towards a particular experience. So when it is useful in that way, I would draw the distinction. In my own like personal life and personal practice in mind, I have some like there's overlap, but I have loose vibes that go with either one. But yeah, I don't have any hard, fast distinctions because I'm just lucky enough to not need them.
Cool. And I'll just add, I know Zach says you can have a symbol in an image, so it's not totally separate for him. And he attaches symbol more to transcendence and imagery more to soul work, for whatever that.
So the spirit soul distinction from Hillman again.
Yeah. So,
Hillman's great.
Thank you. Yeah, he is. Thank you.
If you have one takeaway from all of this, it is read Hillman, everyone. Just pick up more James Hillman, always.
You can check out Zach Stein's metapsychology section at the Stoa. It gives a good overview of those models that Ron just talked about. Cheryl, you got a question?
Yeah, I feel like I just want to really, really deeply appreciate how much all of this is grounded. It feels very deeply grounded and rooted in the body and in the soma. And it actually reminds me of like Benita Roy's been doing work around the new theory of the body, and how much a lot of the work that we're doing in kind of exploring new ways of seeing and being in the world is like oriented around a different understanding of what body means and what our body is in relationship with environment. And something that, like, it's been mentioned several times in this talk that imaginal work in its languaging is so kind of like mired in the visual, like, and I find that even with where eyes are located, because it's in the head, like the visual cortex kind of has this like feedback loop of, it's like you're watching, like your interaction with the imaginal is supposed to be like you're watching a film and you're seeing something happening and then you're engaging with it in that way. But there's like almost something that can feel, I know for people who are very interested in imaginal work, who feel like that's what's supposed to happen, they forget, or it's like there's almost this it doesn't feel sufficiently emphasized how much image, like that mythopoetic cognition, is in the whole body. And even the way that we see and listen and touch and taste and feel is such a like gestalt kind of apparatus, or I don't even want to use the apparatus. It's like there's this deeper capacity that engages the whole body and also energy body. It's like not even just like the traditional five senses, but there's something in it that's of a deeper, I think like Jean Gebser, the philosopher, he would describe it as like a whole structure of consciousness that you're kind of bringing back online, that mythopoetic structure of consciousness. So yeah, I find that there's like something that I just really want to celebrate about how much the somatic pathway in feels really right. Like kind of like reclaiming of the trust of our body and of bodies in environments and in context, and how much that is the way, that's like how we kind of bring ourselves back into relationship with something that's also like world soul, like anima mundi, like the dreams that we participate in are not only our own, but it's like part of a much deeper and wider web. So maybe that's kind of my lead into my question, which is I'm curious about where your edges are in terms of the considerations of like the intersubjective imaginal or the transsubjective imaginal, and that attunement to perhaps like the world soul as well.
There's a lot of longing in my answer to this question, because yeah, the intersubjective bit seems like a huge growth edge for me, largely because I'm living in Albania at the moment. There's not a lot of folks into similar topics as me hanging around Albania. And while I was in Berlin, I started really getting a sense from that group of like, oh, there's a lot of potential in the intersubjective around the imaginal stuff. We're all just kind of swimming in the soup together, and we can slowly figure out ways to like navigate it together. And then I was gone and I was back here. So yeah, my answer for that is that like, I'm unfortunately not the person who gets to be exploring that at the moment. And I have a lot of senses around it, but I have a feeling those would shift enormously the more time I spend in aligned environments. And yeah, we've talked about this before, the environmental, intersubjective, mythopoetic aspects of groups like this. Backchaining a little bit, I do want to, just note with the visual thing and the embodied thing about the imaginal. The deep, like when people get into really deep imaginal states and deep into mythopoetic work around this, you'll notice that even the language starts to shift away from things like sight and towards vaguer senses like scent and taste and texture. People will talk about the texture of an image, this following the scent of an experience, things like this. The visual language seems to work pretty well as an entry point for a lot of people, but it kind of just dissolves as you go, or at least de-emphasizes very strongly. The visual is almost never the core element for me anymore. Oh, and last thing, I just want to call out that out of the many phrases that I stole in this presentation from other people, one of them, I used the phrase that things come to us clothed in the mythopoetic. I directly stole that from a conversation with Cheryl, so thank you.
Very cool.
Got one more hand on Alice.
Thanks. So I've got a question about the relationship between the spontaneous experience and the systematic mode, that distinction that you made. So basically it's about like trusting and befriending the spontaneous experience side. So my experience with this currently is that I've been opening up a lot more to the spontaneous side, and the systematic side doesn't always endorse the kinds of conclusions that end up being pointed at. And so it feels quite threatened. And I was kind of curious because you, I think you said something like, oh, that like there's a way that they can work together or something, like you weren't just dismissing the systematic mode. So any advice on that? I guess maybe like one other element to throw in there is I have a bit of a sense of like you can't put the genie back in the bottle, like there's no going back once you've like opened this stuff up, and I think that in particular is quite threatening. So yeah, just curious to get any thoughts on that.
Yeah, a huge amount. So the relationship between these two is enormously fraught. And I also, just want to complicate that a bit more, because it's really easy to jump in and just go spontaneous, good, systematic, bad, move toward. It is true that basically everyone could benefit from more movement towards spontaneous opening in more areas of their life. Yes. But also, like, I would not be talking to any of you without the wonders of the systematic mind and the technology and culture and everything it has created, as well as like my ability to put together a bunch of frameworks and throw them out into the world until someone asks me to come talk to a group of people. None of that would be remotely possible without systematic mode, right? It's useful, it's great. It's just not great at being in charge of things. And yeah, the title of McGilchrist's first book, Master and His Emissary, really points at this. Like, it makes a very poor master of things. Two things I want to bring up here, really. So one thing, you want to be careful when opening to more systematic stuff, or when opening to more spontaneous experience, particularly in the body, because, well, for a few reasons, but one of which is just being trauma sensitive to yourself, essentially. A lot of the stuff that gets repressed, pushed away, and ignored has gotten that way for a very good reason. One of these that comes up semi-predictably, usually further down the line, but it's a good example, is the fear of death. Everyone's got their fear of death just pushed right the hell down somewhere. And if you keep opening up and keep opening up and keep opening up, it will show up at some point, and you will have some sleepless nights. And it's going to be a rough ride. And it will probably happen in stages. I do not think I have hit like the last round of death opening in myself at all. So that's just one example, but there's a lot of stuff like this where the systematic mode kind of knows where it has buried the radioactive barrels and it's trying to push you away a little bit, in which case working things like somatic experiencing are very useful. These modalities that are particularly particularly aimed at trauma in a somatic way, those can be really helpful for moving past roadblocks like that. Yeah, a lot more to say, but I'll just cut myself off because I've been talking for like 90 minutes. I'll spare everyone.
Very cool.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alice. And do save the chats before you leave, River, because you got some good comments. You might not have caught them all, but we'll.
How do I save a chat?
I can send it to you an email, but you can do the little 3 dots and you go save chats at the bottom. But we'll gently close here. Excellent session. I want to do like a somatic, emotional, imaginal, like a series at the Stoa now. I got inspired by this. Any parting words you'd like to leave us with at the Stoa and anyone watching on the YouTube channel? Yeah, River.
I've said enough. I'm good.
Cool. I'll put your website on the video description if people want to check out your work. And I'll make some upcoming announcements in a moment. But River, thank you so much for coming to Stoa. It's great to have you today. And upcoming events at the Stoa, we got one on unrequited love on Valentine's Day. It should be a cool session. And then next week is post-authenticity, prophilicity, and genuine pretending. And that's on February 20th. So you can check that out, thestoa.ca, and much more events coming up. So that being said, River, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today. Bye, everyone.